The calm of the northern Pacific was broken in a single morning. And the shadow that fell across those waters was not an accident. It was a message. A Russian missile cruiser moved into position. Escorts fanned out behind it. And radar screens from Hokkaido to Alaska lit up with contacts that had not been there the day before. Moscow was not hiding the movement. Moscow wanted it seen. It began with words. On August the 12th, Vladimir Putin spoke about Japan in language he had avoided for years. He called Tokyo an occupied power, a nation that had surrendered its own foreign policy to Washington. And he warned that Russia would no longer treat the Northern Islands as a subject for negotiation. Japanese diplomats who had spent decades keeping a fragile channel open understood immediately what they were hearing. The channel had just been closed. The next day, he did something no Russian leader had done in 26 years in power. He flew east, past Sakhalin, past the gray water of the Sea of Okhotsk. And he landed on a disputed island that Japan calls part of its northern territories and considers its own sovereign soil. Cameras were waiting. Everything about the visit had been staged for the world to watch. He toured a fish processing plant, shook hands with workers in white coats, and tasted local caviar in front of the lenses. It looked ordinary. It was anything but. Every frame of that footage carried the same claim. This is Russian land. These are Russian citizens. This economy is Russian, and no treaty signed elsewhere will change it. Then he visited the Central District Hospital, walked through a local school, spoke with children, and promised new investment. Hospitals and schools are not symbols of a temporary garrison. They are the vocabulary of permanence. Tokyo understood the grammar perfectly. Within hours, the Japanese Foreign Ministry summoned the Russian ambassador and delivered the strongest protest issued in years. The Prime Minister called the visit an unacceptable violation of Japanese sovereignty and canceled every remaining track of bilateral economic dialogue. But behind the formal language, something far larger was already in motion, and it was not being decided in Tokyo alone. Washington moved faster than Moscow expected. Within 36 hours, the United States announced an expanded deployment to the northern approaches. And for the first time, it named the mission openly. Not routine patrols, not a training rotation. A standing presence intended to close the maritime corridor that Russia has used for decades to move its Pacific Fleet from the Sea of Okhotsk into open ocean. That corridor is the entire foundation of Russian naval power in the East, and everyone involved knows it. Then came the part that changed the map. Japan agreed to host and support that mission directly, and went further than any Japanese government has gone since the end of the Second World War. Long-range strike systems were authorized for deployment to the Northern Island chain. Joint command arrangements that had existed only on paper were activated in practice. Japanese and American planners now sit in the same room, reading the same radar picture and working from a single operational plan. 70 years of careful ambiguity ended in a week. For Putin, this is the worst possible outcome, and the irony is that he built it himself. The entire purpose of pressuring Japan was to keep it hesitant, divided, and dependent on a slow diplomatic process that Russia controlled the pace of. Instead, he produced the one thing Moscow has feared since the Cold War: a fully integrated, forward-deployed, heavily armed alliance sitting directly astride the exits from its Pacific Fleet bases. Look at the geography, and the problem becomes obvious. The Russian Pacific Fleet is based around Vladivostok and the Kamchatka Peninsula. To reach the open Pacific, it must pass through narrow straits, and And every one of those straits is now watched, mapped and covered by sensors and weapons controlled by the alliance. The bastion strategy that protects Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrent depends on the Sea of Okhotsk remaining a sanctuary. It is no longer a sanctuary. It is a closed room with the door being welded shut from the outside. The economic dimension is just as sharp. Russia's pivot to Asia was supposed to compensate for everything lost in Europe. Energy exports, shipping through the Northern Sea Route, fisheries, and rare earth development in the Far East were the pillars of that plan. Every one of those pillars runs through waters that are now contested. A pivot to Asia that cannot guarantee safe passage is not a pivot at all. And Japan is not acting alone. Even states that avoided taking sides on Europe find it far easier to justify participation in what is being framed as freedom of navigation and the defense of an established maritime order. The coalition Moscow spent 2 decades trying to prevent is assembling in the one theater where Russia can least afford it. There is another audience for all of this, and it sits in Beijing. China has spent years building a partnership with Moscow that assumes Russian strength in the Pacific. What Beijing is now watching is a rehearsal. It is seeing how quickly the United States can surge forces, how fast Japan can shed its constitutional caution, and how willingly regional states will fall in behind a single command structure. It is seeing how quickly the United States can surge forces, how fast Japan can shed its constitutional caution, and how willingly regional states will fall in behind a single command structure. Every lesson learned in the North is directly transferable to the waters around Taiwan, and Chinese planners know it. Russia has just paid the cost of a demonstration that benefits Washington and unsettles its own closest partner. The military balance in that corner of the world was never actually favorable to Russia. It was manageable only because Japan restrained itself and the United States kept its attention elsewhere. Both of those conditions have now been removed. Against a fully mobilized Japanese force with American strike support, the numbers do not work. And the men who run the Russian general staff can read a spreadsheet as well as anyone. So what happens now? Moscow has 3 choices, and none of them are good. It can escalate, which invites a response it cannot match in that theater. It can hold position and absorb the pressure, which confirms that the red line it drew meant nothing. Or it can quietly seek an off-ramp, which, after such a public display of ownership, would be read at home as retreat. This is what happens when a leader spends a symbolic gesture as if it were a strategic asset. The Japanese public shifted too. That may be the most permanent change of all. Support for expanded defense spending, once politically dangerous, has become mainstream. Once a society crosses that line, it does not step back quickly. Whatever happens in the next months, the Japan that emerges will be a very different country from the one that existed at the start of that August. Meanwhile, the islands themselves have become something no one intended. What was a slow, quiet, decades-long dispute conducted through diplomats and fishing agreements is now alive. Military frontier with weapons pointed in both directions and almost no communication between the two sides. That is the real danger. Not a planned war, because neither side wants one, but an unplanned collision. An aircraft that flies too close. A vessel that misreads an intention. A radar lock held a few seconds too long by a crew that is tired and under pressure. The history of this region is full of such moments, and they were survived because channels existed to explain them. Those channels are closed now. Putin wanted to remind the world that Russia is a Pacific power. He succeeded in the narrowest possible sense. Everyone is now looking at the Pacific. But what they see is not Russian strength. They see an aging fleet penned into an inland sea, an economy that cannot fund the confrontation it has provoked, a partner in Beijing quietly taking notes, and an alliance that grew stronger in 1 week than in the previous 30 years combined. They see an aging fleet penned into an inland sea, an economy that cannot fund the confrontation it has provoked, a partner in Beijing quietly taking notes, and an alliance that grew stronger in 1 week than in the previous 30 years combined. The Pacific Dream, the one where Russia balances the West through Asia and turns the Far East into a second front of influence, required Japan to stay uncertain and America to stay distracted. Both of those things ended on a windswept island runway in the middle of August. The cruiser is still out there, still visible on the screens, but it is no longer a threat being projected. It is a warning being contained. The region holds its breath. The rules that governed it for 2 generations have been discarded, and nothing has yet been written to replace them.